So something that I've mulled over for some time now and kind of toyed with the idea of doing a video, it's effectively an opinion piece video, which is what this video is on the subject of artificial intelligence and the perceived dangers of artificial intelligence. And we're talking really here about what is called strong artificial intelligence, or sometimes artificial in general intelligence, which isn't the kind of AI, the routines that we see nowadays within computer programs, within the algorithms that people like Google use, within some equipment that we have in the home. But it's a higher level. It's levels of cognitive function that are similar to those we possess ourselves, or perhaps even levels greater than ourselves. It was a guy called Irving Goddard in 1965. This is a guy who'd worked at Bletchley Park with Alan Turing. Came up with this idea. He probably wasn't the first, but he was the first, I think, to get credit for it, of this idea of what became known as a technological singularity, which is this idea that once intelligence, artificial intelligence, gets to a similar level to ourselves, if we can make machines that have intelligence of a similar level to ourselves, then we can make machines that are at the same level or a slightly higher level, then they will be able to make machines that are a slightly higher level still. So you've got a kind of exponential effect there, and it does act a little bit like you would think of as a singularity there, which is then all of a sudden, woof, it's going to go right off the top of the scale, isn't it? Whereas a singularity diminishes down to nothing, I suppose this kind of goes in the opposite direction, but it gives you an idea of what people are talking about. And then there are the dangers, and we're all aware of the kinds of dangers of sort of robots taking over the place, or artificially grabbing hold of our computer network and not letting go for nefarious means, or means that are contrary to the interest of human beings, which are more or less one and the same thing from our perspective. So I've wanted to do a video musing on some of these things for quite a while, but then as it's kind of evolved in my mind, I've wanted to tie them in also with the idea of aliens. And so what I want to think of first is the idea of aliens and aliens invading the Earth, which is always quite an interesting one. And if aliens, this idea that an alien civilization comes along and wants to plunder the Earth for resources, sometimes it's to eat us, or sometimes they want the water, or whatever the fuck it is on that particular occasion. There's always something that we've got that they desperately need. And Paul Davies, who you probably be aware is a popular science writer who's made popular science books for some time now, he made a book a couple of years ago called The Eerie Silence, which I don't own, but my father owned, and he was taking so long reading it, I just borrowed it off him and read it all and gave him it back. Much to his annoyance in some ways, because he'd only dipped into the book, and then I'm telling him all about the rest of the bits of the book he hadn't read. But Paul Davies, who has some relevance in this field, right, because he was a member of SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. In fact, he was the chair of something like their post-detection department or whatever, and so he had quite a fundamental role in that, and he may still have that role. I don't know if he's abandoned that role, if he's still the chairperson of that role. He talks about the way in which the conspiracy theorists always have this idea that governments would immediately clamp down on it, and his experience of actually being in the hot seat here and contacting governments and saying, if I get this kind of information, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to let you know about it? What do you want to do? And governments basically not giving a fuck about, rather than like, yes, tell us, otherwise all these people are going to come round and fucking machine gun your family. We need to be the first people to know. Just basically not giving a fuck about it, which I found quite amusing, really. But what he talks about is how naive and parochial we are when we consider aliens and the idea that they would come to us, that they would travel these phenomenal distances which he discusses in the book might not even be possible. I'm quite pessimistic about that organic life forms could feasibly travel those kinds of distances. I'm just not sure that that's ever going to be a possibility, which is quite a pessimistic outlook, really. But even if it is a possibility, that they would be motivated to travel all this distance because they needed our resources, physical resources, you know, water or something to eat or some kind of bullshit like that, which is what these things always kind of boil down to, that they would be way past that, that we're going past that already. There was a time when the most important resource that you could have was land, you know, the area of colonialism, and you colonized because you wanted those natural resources. And we're already getting to a point where information has become more important than natural resources. We're not entirely there yet, but imagine if we could just harbour nuclear fusion. We've already solved all the bullshit issues then to do with gas and oil and all that kind of stuff, which is perhaps the biggest concern that we have. There are locations, you know, there are satellites orbiting some of our planets that have got as much water that as we've got here. There is no need to come here and have to wipe us all out for these resources. So that was the point that he made, that it's kind of really naive. It's looking at it from a very human perspective to think that they would bother doing that with those kind of intent. The idea they can get a lot more, if information is a lot more valuable to them, then they would come here to discover us, to explore us, to experience us, perhaps, rather than anything else. So that was his point with regard to that. But a point that I always thought with regard to aliens, which is something that is quite relevant in terms of artificial intelligence, was an evolutionary perspective, which I always thought of in terms of, you know, aliens are always pictured as being hyper intelligent. And by hyper intelligent I mean more intelligent. Anything that's more intelligent than human beings, hyper intelligent. And the idea that aliens would have evolved to be more intelligent than we are, and yet we're not. There's no evolutionary pressure on us to be more intelligent than we are. In fact, if you look at sort of the people that are having children, it doesn't seem to be the people that are at least expressing their intelligence the most, if you look at the kind of demographics of it. So it doesn't seem as that evolutionary pressure is even there for us now. And certainly if you can make machines, if you've got to the level where you can make machines that are more intelligent than you are, then the evolutionary pressure surely to become more intelligent entirely disappears. There is no evolutionary advantage whatsoever to be gained from being more intelligent there. So I kind of wonder if the level of intelligence that we've reached perhaps is a kind of maximal level in terms of evolution. That if you want, you have to sort of go to the transhuman level, or you have to go to some kind of artificial selection, or some kind of actual manipulation of DNA, or, like I say, sometimes some type of transhuman or cybernetic involvement if you want to take us beyond the level we're already at. So my expectation would be any aliens that hadn't done any of those manipulation techniques would be as intelligent as we are, and probably no more and probably no less. That we're just kind of at that sweet spot now where evolution maxes out on that intelligence curve. So that's kind of that's my thoughts that have always been on that. The reason that I bring that in is I think the issue of evolution is one that's almost unavoidable if you want to consider these dangers of strong AI that we're talking about. Just to kind of set the scene a little bit with regard to that, I'll read you a comment that was made quite recently by Stephen Hawking. Quite a lot of people have chimed in on this recently. The Stuart Russell, of course, who's really into this kind of thing, he's been talking about it. Elon Musk, there was a conference about all this, he's donated $10 million to this. Stephen Hawking's chimed in on it. Bill Gates has chimed in on it. Loads of people have had their say, and they're all concerned about the dangers of this. And I want to talk about the dangers of this, but I want to talk about it also in terms of an evolutionary context. But let me make this comment that Stephen Hawking had made, which was this, and I won't do the Stephen, maybe shall I do the Stephen Hawking voice? Perhaps I shall try. The primitive, no, I won't try now. The primitive forms of artificial intelligence we already have proved very useful. But I think the development of full artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race. Bum, bum, bum. Once humans develop artificial intelligence, it would take off on its own and redesign itself in an ever-increasing rate. Humans who are limited by slow biological evolution couldn't compete and would be superseded. It's interesting that Stephen Hawking thinks of in terms of evolution there, in terms of its effects on humans biologically slowing us down. We can't iterate ourselves one on another, either on a sort of software level or in terms of creating physical manifestations of ourselves in the way that computers could, artificial intelligence is running on systems could, or in terms of a sort of machine churning out robots, and robots, androids turning out more androids and superior androids could do perhaps. Right, we're tied into a system evolutionary. But there's another aspect to the evolutionary process that needs to be considered, I think, which is really quite critical to this. And that's to not take an anthropomorphic view of what general intelligence, strong AI, must involve, but to start thinking about which things are likely to be emergent from having that level of intelligence, whether you got there through a process of evolution or not, and which ones are artifacts, the results purely of a process of evolution, and are perhaps inescapable artifacts of evolution, such as the desire to reproduce. And I think, well, there's two desires really. One is the desire to survive, and one is the desire to multiply. And I've written it down here, which is that a system that is concerned about its survival is a system that will survive, and a system that is motivated to iterate itself physically or electronically is the system that will iterate itself. They both sound pretty obvious fucking things to say, but perhaps that is why they are so fundamental to the whole issue of evolution, because of course it is those organisms that have a desire to survive, that do survive and are more likely to get to reproduce, which is why we have such a strong desire to survive, because it has that evolutionary advantage. And that a system that is motivated to iterate itself, and let's not get into these kind of antinatalist arguments as to whether do we really desire to reproduce or do we just desire to fuck. It doesn't really matter from an evolutionary perspective, certainly up until very recently. It doesn't make any difference what part of the process evolution has worked on, whether it's your desire to fuck or your desire to see little copies of you running around. The point is you end up with little copies of you running around, and that is the important thing. There is a desire that leads you to multiply, and if you have that, that is a huge evolutionary advantage, because it means that you don't just die out after one generation. But it's a very anthropomorphic way to assume that the robots are going to take over, because they will have that same desire to iterate themselves. If those robots, they may have general intelligence, they may have strong AI, they may be more intelligent than we are, but if they haven't come about from a process, an evolutionary process, then there is no reason to suspect that they would be motivated to have that desire to iterate themselves either physically or electronically in the same way that we have that desire, because that is a fundamental component, I propose, of evolution. Now, one of the things I'm always really keen to do is to try and share with you the things that I think are the most interesting aspects to think about, with the things that I've found the most interesting aspects to think about with regard to the things that I discuss in my videos. And one of the most interesting aspects, I think, with regard to this is whether survival is of the same kind of thing. Sure, we have evolved a sense of survival, of a desire to survive, but is that simply an artifact of the evolutionary process, or would it have arisen anyway if we had the level of intelligence that we have, but we hadn't got that via an evolutionary process? Would that be the same as I'm proposing with reproduction, or is it slightly different? Is there something intrinsic about having this level of intelligence that necessarily would lead to a desire to survive anyway? After all, we are intelligent enough to be able to introspect, to be able to be aware of our own consciousness, and to be able to imagine, or to be able to fail to imagine, that consciousness not existing anymore, and to be somewhat horrified at that prospect. So is that something that would arrive anyway? If I was just to create out of the blue, create an artificial intelligence of a similar intelligence level than we have, would it be motivated to survive? Would it introspect and think, no, do you know what, this is something that I don't want to abandon, I really can't imagine myself not existing, this is something that I'm going to fight to cling on to? I think that's a really interesting one to consider. But with regard to the dangers, I do think that there are some dangers that are potentially involved in strong AI. What I don't think is that they fundamentally emerge as a result of something having strong AI, but I think they perhaps emerge as a result of the process, or in the second case, somewhere along the way. Let's talk about the process first. So I've talked about the fact that the evolutionary process has given us some of our characteristics, so that's what I've proposed. But what about if we use the evolutionary process to create the AI? Perhaps there's a real danger there, and we already have something that is called evolutionary computation, and that can take many forms, but one of the forms it takes, and I'm sure there'll be some computer experts who'll just fill in some of the details here, I'm not a computer expert, but that you have computer systems that we allow to learn about their environments, and from the feedback they get to learn more about their environment. So there is a process of trial and error, which is the random component, the mutational component that you have with evolution. And then there is the feedback from it, and there is the evaluation of that feedback, which is the same as the natural selection process. Okay, so you have this process, and as a result of that, the systems get better and better. They get more sophisticated in dealing with what it is we've tasked them to deal with. And so that is an evolutionary process in itself. But what about if we applied that more generally, if we applied that to the computational system as a whole? And into getting one computational system, one AI, to design another via using an evolutionary process. I'm sure you can see where I'm going with regard to the dangers here, and this is regardless of whether we're talking about generally intelligent androids that are making more androids, or whether we're talking about what Stuart Russell calls AI systems that rewrite themselves. Okay, what we're talking about here is a system where one kind of AI system is making iterations of itself that are slightly mutated, and where there is now a premium on having those things that work so well under an evolutionary environment, such as being motivated to multiply. That has an advantage in terms of then multiplying. So that's perhaps a danger, that if we use those kind of evolutionary systems, we do then put those evolved characteristics that we do possess, those anthropomorphic characteristics that we're seeing the dangers there, we perhaps now have good grounds to see those dangers. So I think that's one of the problems. And the other is a problem that Nick Bostrom brought up in a book that he wrote last year called Superintelligence. And I've had to edit this bit because what I wanted to say was that I have the book, but I haven't read the book yet. When I came to look at the footage, I put that I had the book, but I haven't written the book yet. Of course, I am not Nick Bostrom, so admittedly, I haven't written the book yet, but Nick Bostrom has. I have the book, I haven't read it yet. But I've read about the book, and I've read about the problem that he talks about. And what he talks about is that these AI systems could become too task-focused. But what we do is we give these systems a task, and then they try and fulfill that task. They're working in good faith. They're trying to do that task, but in doing so they cause more harm than good. It's something that Stuart Russell talks about. He talks about a robot, and he says, what about you've got this domestic robot and it sees that there's no food left in the fridge and the kids need feeding, so it sticks the cat in the oven and cooks the cat for you. You know, that isn't kind of what we want to achieve, is it, here? And what Nick Bostrom talks about is perhaps slightly more simple examples, which is like solving the Riemann hypothesis. And this computer is so invested in doing that it decides to turn the whole Earth into a kind of computer to try and solve that hypothesis. Or make paper clips. We just tell this machine to fucking make paper clips, make as many paper clips as you can, and it ends up turning the Earth. It's quite a marvellous kind of thing to think about, really, this sort of barren wasteland that is just full of mountains of paper clips. All it does is just turns the world into a junkyard of paper clips, which is kind of, you imagine these aliens coming across, finding this planet, can't you? And all it consists of is just oceans lapping up against continents of paper clips. But those are the kind of things that some of the things that he foresees as a danger from the bits that I've read around his book. And I think that's kind of interesting, that kind of task focus. And that is maybe one of the problems, that kind of thing that we need to deal with. And Stuart Russell gives us an example of how we could deal with it with something called inverse reinforcement learning. This is what he talks about here. He says, for example, your domestic robot sees you crawl out of bed in the morning. Out of bed, sorry, not bread. If you sleep in a loaf, then I suppose you call out of bread. And grind up some brown round things in a very noisy machine and do some complicated thing with steam and hot water and milk and so on. And then you seem to be happy. It should learn that part of the human value function in the morning is having some coffee. So rather than being given a specific task and saying, complete that task at all costs, and then just seeing, the computer can kind of extrapolate what that involves and take it out of all context, the computer learns about what we would want it to do and then starts to build from the ground up. And perhaps that's a more interesting way of doing it with this kind of inverse reinforcement learning. But I think that the problem Nick Bostrom sees there isn't really with strong AI. It isn't really with intelligence of our level or above our level, but it's intelligence as it's approaching our level. After all, if you employed me and said, Jim, make paper clips at all costs, just make as many paper clips as you can, because us human beings, we've got pieces of paper, right, and we need to clip the fucking things together. I'd immediately realise, right, even with my simpleton walnut brain, that if I created so many fucking paper clips that nobody existed anymore, that the purpose for making those paper clips would no longer exist. So I hadn't really fulfilled the function that I'd been set out to do. I can see round that function. I can see what those paper clips are serving. I can see why I'm making those paper clips. And so that in itself limits what I'm prepared to do to go about making paper clips. So I think actually any hyper-intelligent organism would see round those things. I don't see that as being, I mean, that is a classic doomsday scenario, isn't it? It's the kind of, a bit like the game Portal, where GLaDOS just keeps testing whatever it's supposed to test, computer's supposed to test, and so all it's focused in is on testing, this kind of thing. I don't really see that with that level of intelligence. Maybe at a lower level of intelligence that's a problem. So anyway, that's kind of where I'm at with this. I do see dangers. I don't see any dangers with aliens, to be honest. I don't think there's any chance of aliens getting here. I'm a bit pessimistic. If they do get here, I don't think there's anything that we've got that they want other than to have a bit of a nosy round, to be quite honest. With regard to AI, I think there are dangers. I think there are dangers if we get to that level of AI through an evolutionary iterative process, because then the same things hold true with evolved organisms, which is that desire to dominate, that land grab, that desire to iterate and multiply. Those things then hold true. If you get at it through another process, then I really think we need to be a lot more open-minded about what characteristics will be emergent and what characteristics are really just anthropomorphic hangovers that we possess from that evolutionary process. I do think that task-focused AI issues could be an issue, but I think they're issues that we'll find along the way, and hopefully before things are off the leash, because hopefully before AI systems get to that level of strong AI. That's all I've got to say on this. I'd be very, very interested to know what people think as a result. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.